Go ahead and get started with chapter 3 here. So for the most part, I would say chapter 3 is the shortest. It's the most brief of the first 3 chapters. And as far as the exam goes, probably, and of course I'm saying this as we're about to go over it, probably the least important chapter. It's the shortest, doesn't have the most amount of information. I would say most of the information on the exam comes from chapter 1 and chapter 2, but it's certainly a valuable chapter. If we think about it, chapter 1 was pretty much about all European colonization. That was when we covered the Spanish, the English, the Dutch, the French. Chapter 2 focused mostly on just the English colonization, pretty much how all 13 colonies came established. Chapter 3 is focused kind of like, looking at those 13 colonies and then saying, okay, what is the same between them and what is different between them. So that's kind of where we're at. Same. Is we're focusing mostly on just the 13 English colonies collectively as a group. Whereas last chapter, we were looking at the colonies specifically, individually, right? Pennsylvania, Carolina, New York, Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to say just, we're going to remark about just generally, what were the trends in the 13 colonies leading all the way up essentially to 1776. And that's going to be an important year because that's when the Declaration of Independence was signed, essentially marking the separation of the 13 colonies, pretty much, the separation of 13 colonies from Great Britain. So we're kind of in this pre-American Revolution period, looking at what the colonies did. Some of the trends that we already talked about was the transition from indentured servitude to African slavery. Certainly by the time of the American Revolution, slavery is what we might say the predominant labor system in the South. In fact, if we look at this map here, it is a map of the colonial population, giving you an idea of just how diverse it was. And in the brown represents the African population. And you can see that especially in the southern colonies, in these particular areas of the Low Country, that's where rice was grown, and in the Chesapeake where there was tobacco, which was grown there. So certainly by 1776, for the most part, indentured servitude has gone, right? It's no longer there. And slavery has replaced it. Now, as far as the development of slavery goes in the English colonies, there's a couple of important things to take note of. First of all is the origins. I just want to keep an eye out here on people who might have become disconnected and are coming back. But anyways, are the origins of it. First, the very first slaves to arrive in the English colonies came from the Caribbean. Recall that Portugal, then the Dutch, brought the first African slaves to the New World. Most of them went to the Caribbean to grow sugar. The very first African slaves to arrive in the English colonies came from the Caribbean to sugar plantations to essentially Jamestown in 1619. So it wasn't the first slaves coming directly from Africa. It's that African slavery had already existed in the Caribbean by the Portuguese, by the Dutch, on sugar plantations. And the first African slaves arrived then to Jamestown to grow tobacco in 1619. And that's why that year is important. By the 1700s, the Dutch have more or less lost the slave trade to the English. And if we're just trying to think about chronologically how the Atlantic slave trade develops, we might think of the Portuguese as being the major facilitators in the 1500s, the Dutch in the 1600s, and then lastly, the English in the 1700s. Despite that, most slaves still went to the Caribbean and Brazil. right? Although there were a number of slaves that were brought to the English colonies, especially the areas that I outlined here on the on the map, most still ended up in the Caribbean and Brazil growing sugar. The Middle Passage, this is a great key term that you're going to want to know. The Middle Passage is the name for the voyage from Africa to the New World. All right, so the Middle Passage is the voyage from Africa to the New World. It was especially deadly. We can look here at a map. This is actually showing a Dutch slave ship. And this map shows, or not this map, but this image shows how people were really packed in when it came to the African slave trade. Food was inadequate, medicine was inadequate. People were chained down on these ships by their hands, by their necks. Disease was probably the #1 killer. The Middle Passage could claim the lives of around, anywhere from about 20 to 25% of slaves died simply just on the Middle Passage alone, right? So it claimed about a quarter of those that were there. And it was especially, devastating. You can compare the Middle Passage to just about any other atrocity that people have committed against one another. It ranks right up there with any other atrocity that you could possibly think of. However, though, like I mentioned earlier, this larger slave trade, again, we call it the Atlantic slave trade, even though the English colonies are involved, we would only say approximately 5% of all slaves went to the English colonies. Right, so out of all the slaves that were transported during the Middle Passage, during the years 1500 to 1800, only about 5% ended up in the English colonies. The vast majority, right, ended up in either Brazil or the Caribbean. There are reasons for that. Probably the #1 is due to the nature of the crops that were grown. Whereas in the English colonies, it was primarily rice and tobacco. I think it's 2 C's, tobacco. In the Caribbean, sugar was much more of a physically demanding crop. Pretty much slaves were worked to death in the Caribbean, whereas in the English colonies, tobacco was pretty difficult too, but rice was a little bit less labor intensive. This also shaped the way that demographics or slave demographics played out. So for example, in the Caribbean and Brazil and in the Caribbean, it was mostly young men. Whereas in the English colonies, you were much more likely to see enslaved men and enslaved women. The population in the slave population in Brazil and the Caribbean was not self-sustaining. Essentially, the only way to ensure that the slave population maintained its level was by importing, whereas the slave population in the English colonies was reproducing in the English colonies. It didn't require any sort of constant importation, right, to occur. And the way that the slavery system in the English colonies especially, and one more point about this. So 5% of all slaves went to the English colonies. Out of that, 95% went to the South, right? So an overwhelming number. When you actually got to the English colonies, almost all of the African slaves were located in the Southern colonies. And this, has a dramatic impact on the shaping and development of the United States, like we're going to talk about it in another couple of chapters or so. The slave system, especially in the South, came to define not just the economic system, but also the political, cultural, and social system. Slave codes. Slave codes are laws which enforce slavery. Right, so these laws were ambiguous in the 1600s, right? There really was no differentiation, at least legally speaking, when it came to indentured servitude, when it came to the law codes. But as African slaves replaced white indentured servants, law codes changed to create a society in which race was ultimately the determining factor. And you can see this in various law codes that, for example, say, okay, if a white indentured servant escapes, then he should have that punishment. But if a black indentured servant escapes, then he gets a different punishment. He gets a more harsh punishment. And these laws were passed, again, in each of these different colonies and had slightly different variations, but more or less were all the same, and ensured that this system of slavery became more and more entrenched in the English colonies as time went on. Also, demographically speaking, a couple other points that I do want to also make. Most of the earliest English colonists were English in nature, as you might imagine. The purple represents the English population. You can see the English population is pretty much the dominant population all along the coast here, especially in New England. However, there is a small, and this is the green represents the Dutch. Again, recall that New York was New Netherland. But there were two demographics that were increasingly moving to the colonies, and they were different than the, what you might say, older English colonists. That was Germans, who spoke a different language, and the Scotch-Irish, who tended to have a different religion, which was Catholic. Recall we talked about the Protestant Reformation, Catholics and Protestants. Most English were Protestants. However, most Scottish and Irish, especially the Irish, tend to be much more Catholic. And this causes a little bit of what you might call ethnic tension. However, these population groups did remain somewhat separate. So, for example, if we look at our map here, our German immigrants are in the orange. They tend to be a lot more inland, whereas English people were much more likely to be involved with things like merchant activity, trading. English colonists were also much more likely to be involved in government because all the colonial governments were on the coastline. Germans tended to be more farmers. And then you had the Scottish and the Irish who lived up in what they would call at the time, the boonies. They lived just in the woods. And the Scottish and the Irish tended to be the most self-sufficient. They lived very similar to the way that Native Americans lived, that is off the land, by hunting, maybe a little bit of agriculture here and there, but mostly not relying upon anything like trade. It was a very difficult and tough environment. But at the same time, even though the lifestyle by the Scottish and Irish, and to some extent the Germans, mirrored that of Native Americans, it was the Scottish and the Irish who tended to get into the most conflict with Native Americans as well. And that was also true. So by the time you get to the American Revolution, by the time you get to 1776, you've got a pretty diverse colonial world, at least a lot more diverse than a lot of other places around the world. And it's interesting because, when Thomas Jefferson writes, all men are created equal, he doesn't say all English-speaking Protestant men are created equal. I mean, he very well could have. In fact, there were probably a vast majority of people that would have preferred that it stated all English-speaking Protestant men are created equal. But that was in part a reflection of how the colonial world was more diverse, right? How there were different demographic groups. In fact, the highest source or the largest source of immigration between 1700 and 1770, and I think your video series talks about this, was Africans. More so than anyone else, more Africans arrived to the 13 colonies than did any other single demographic group, right? Any questions about demographics, population, how that's changing? Okay, so let's move on to the economies. So again, our theme is we're looking at all 13 colonies. And when we look at all 13 colonies, we can pretty much break it into three categories: the North, the Middle, and the South. When it comes to making money, and of course I always like to get my green pen when it comes to money, the South is the one that produces the cash crops, right? They produce tobacco, they produce rice. The South is the most valuable part of the colonial world, right? Tobacco, rice, all of these for export, right? This makes England very happy, right? England is very happy with the southern colonies. Whereas when you look at the northern colonies, again, recall, what was the purpose for a colony like Massachusetts? What was the purpose for a colony like Rhode Island? Anybody want to answer that or type it in chat? Good religion, right? You know, the Puritans, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, established Massachusetts to live as a separate religious community. No desire to make money, at least maybe make money for themselves, but no desire to make money for England. In fact, the Puritans were trying to get away from England because they thought it was corrupt. The Pilgrims were getting away from England. And then once all the Puritans got to Massachusetts, they all fought each other over their religion, and then they went out and created all these different colonies, right? Rhode Island was for the people who wanted more religious toleration. Connecticut was another colony that was created. You know, these were not built to make money. And so whereas the southern colonies make England very happy, we could say that the northern colonies make England, you know, very sad. They're useless. They don't do anything, right? They don't produce anything of value. So when it came to the northern economies, things were a lot more diverse. I mean, people did kind of a little bit of everything. You know, we might say, you know, shipbuilding was kind of a big part. The northern colonies produced iron to some extent. They produced lumber, you know, things like wood, but not really a lot economically. Instead, people just took up like different what you call, you know, different professions. So you had perhaps maybe blacksmiths, you had leather workers, you know, all these different craftspeople. This term artisan is another good term to be familiar with. This is a skilled, we'll call it a skilled worker who makes things with their hands, right? So an artisan is any type of skilled worker who makes things with their hands. A blacksmith, a shoemaker, a furniture maker, a clock maker, whatever it may be. And the North, there were a lot of these various different artisans. And so at the same time, it also meant that the North was a little bit more economically independent, you might say, more economically self-sufficient. Whereas the South required somebody to buy all their goods, the Northern economy could thrive somewhat independently. We'll talk a little bit more about artisans in particular, but you had a lot more abundance of them. And so this put the colonial world, the 13 colonies, into a much larger trade network. We call this the triangle trade. So the triangle trade is the network of trade between New World, Europe, and Africa. And of course, we're focused on the 13 English colonies in particular. So we'll go ahead and draw our 13 English colonies here. And for the most part, when it came to exports, I doubt that you could probably see it all too well. But tobacco, of course, was a very important export that came this way along the trade route. Sugar from the Indies also was an important one. It also might be added that for the colonial economy, sugar also traveled up here. And one of the ways that the northern economies made money was by turning that sugar into rum. So the rum business was actually pretty significant in the northern colonies. But you can see all these things are going primarily to Europe, where they're consuming them, right? In European coffee houses and tea houses, they're drinking coffee with sugar, tea with sugar. You know, they're producing later on cotton made goods. And then, of course, from Europe, you have various manufactured goods that are, I draw these lines here, that are sent to Africa, specifically guns, right? Guns were imported pretty heavily. And then the last leg of the triangle trade is slaves. We might do guns and tobacco, right? And, you know, what do you call it? The 13 colonies were very much part of this world. In fact, so much so that you could say before the American Revolution, a colony like Massachusetts had stronger economic connections to England than it did with another colony like Connecticut. You know, in other words, the colonies really aren't trading with each other. They're not buying and selling off of each other. They're exporting goods to Europe, and then that is kind of playing a bigger part in this, you know, larger triangle trade. And of course, you can see why they call it the triangle trade, because you have somewhat of a, you know, the makings of a triangle in here, right? The 3 points of it. Now, very important law/policy here. In fact, the Navigation Acts is going to be one of the long-term causes of American Revolution. Like I said before, the southern colonies make England very happy, right? The more money that the southern colonies can make, the better it is for England. And in fact, the better it is for the southern colonies. The northern colonies are kind of like, you know, it's like shoving a, what do they call it, a square peg into a round hole. They just don't quite fit with the larger idea of what an English empire ought to be. Recall, we talked about mercantilism, right? If you don't know that, that's a good term to go review before you take the exam. But mercantilism was the idea that wealth was finite, that to become the most valuable and powerful nation, one has to hoard as much silver and gold as possible, and that translated into laws that restricted trade. And that's essentially what the Navigation Acts do. So the Navigation Acts say that the colonies can only trade with, and we'll say Britain, right, with Britain. Right, I'll go ahead and make that a little bit more clear. All right, so the Navigation Acts are a series of laws that state colonies can only trade with Great Britain. And the fear is, by Great Britain at least, the fear is that the colonies are buying goods from other countries, buying goods from the Dutch, buying goods from the English, buying goods from the Spanish. And by buying goods from those countries, you're giving those countries gold, giving them more power and, you know, or giving them more wealth, and, you know, in turn making England less wealthy. As you might imagine, the Navigation Acts did not sit well with the colonists. They were not happy with the fact that now England was telling them who they could and could not trade with. So when it comes to the American Revolution, we're going to talk about three long-term causes. The first long-term cause we might identify as economic. That is, Great Britain attempting to dictate who the colonies can or cannot trade with, right, via the Navigation Acts. All right, any questions on that? Any questions on the Navigation Acts? Okay. Okay, so patterns of society. We'll talk a little bit on this point here. In terms of those societies in which African slavery was the most prevalent, it was a society in which slave communities were very important. Family and religion, we might call these the pillars of slave society and culture. A little bit less so in the early years, but certainly later on. For example, something like literacy will become illegal in pretty much all of the southern colonies, and later on the US states after the American Revolution. So in order for society and culture to thrive, oral tradition was very important. When it came to working on tobacco plantations, it differed a little bit. So for example, on the rice plantations, slaves tended to have a little bit more, I might say more freedom. Again, the rice plantations were those in Georgia and South Carolina in particular. Because there was a little bit more freedom, African culture tended to thrive a little bit more. For example, you may have heard of the language Gullah, which is a mixture of African and English, and this thrived in some of the more remote areas of South Carolina. The reason because there was a little bit more freedom on the rice plantations was because the type of labor that was involved typically didn't require an overseer. It was based off of a task system. Essentially, slaves were given a task for the day, and they were required to complete it. And as long as that task was fulfilled, then slaves had a little bit more freedom in dictating when they could or could not work. And because of that, because there was less, for example, interactions between masters and slaves in the Low Country, that's why things like culture were more likely to survive. Whereas on the, and I'm running out of room here, the tobacco plantations, there was a lot less freedom. More likely to have slaves converted to Christianity, especially in the colonial period. It was gang labor, and more or less was dictated by the sun. Slaves were required to work in the fields with an overseer in very close proximity to the slave master from sunrise till sunset. And those types of working conditions, because there was more interaction, you might say, with slave owners or slave masters who also typically wanted to convert their slaves to Christianity, there tended to be less retention of African culture in places like Maryland and Virginia, for example. But both of these things, what we could say about slavery in the Low Country on rice plantations and slavery in tobacco plantations, was again, family and religion were sort of were the basis of society and culture, and that both of these, whether you're talking about South Carolina, Georgia, or tobacco in Virginia, that at the end of the day, it was violence which kept the system in place, right? Slave codes or law codes, which were backed by violence. A lot of these colonies had militias, which, in the earlier days, maybe the early 1600s, or not early 1600s, but mid 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s, these were militias which typically warred with Native Americans. By the 1700s, that was less common in especially the more coastal regions. And a lot of these militias were more or less there to prevent any sort of slave rebellion and slave uprisings. Now, when it came to slave rebellions and uprisings, the most bloody and violent one was the Stono Rebellion. This was in South Carolina. And I may actually, let me just check the date on this real quick. If I can, I don't know if I can while I'm sharing the screen. I believe it's 1720, I want to say. Nope, 1739. And this was the most deadly slave revolt. All right, the most deadly slave revolt occurring in South Carolina. It essentially was inspired by, or partially inspired by, the fact of Spain's presence in Florida. Spain and England were rivals. Essentially, what the Spanish promised was freedom for any slaves who escaped from English colonies, adopted Catholicism, and fought for the Spanish army. And so a group of slaves in Stono, South Carolina, rose up, killed anybody who opposed them, and attempted to make it to Florida. Like most slave revolts and rebellions in the New World, like most slave revolts and rebellions in the English colonies, it failed. Whereas you had, in some cases, I don't know if I'd say more successful revolts in other parts of the Atlantic world, but certainly you had more rebellions. When it came to the English colonies in particular, slaves were outnumbered, spread out, had families, and quite frankly, better alternatives. So we typically don't see as many slave revolts in the English colonies as we do in other parts of the Atlantic world. So for example, Brazil, Jamaica, Barbados, Haiti, any of those areas. When it came to resistance, resistance was constant. It could be anything from doing something wrong on purpose to pretending to be sick. But the most common and maybe most effective form of resistance was running away. Right? Maybe not the most common, but we'll say the most effective. Oops. Most effective resistance. And that had to do partially with the geography of the colonies. Like I mentioned before, one of the reasons why rebellions were less successful is because the slave population, comparatively speaking, was very spread out. And so that left a lot of room to run away. Slaves stood a much better chance of survival running away. And in terms of inflicting economic and other sorts of damage on slave masters, running away was about as good as it got, because that way then the slave owner lost essentially his investment in whatever slave that he had purchased. So running away, especially in the English colonies, was much more common and a lot more effective in terms of resistance, in terms of survival, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if you looked at the nature of slavery on sugar plantations, again, these are typically slaves that are almost all men. They can expect to die at the age of 23. They outnumber their white slave owners by 6 to 1, 8 to 1, 9 to 1 in some cases. And if you try to run away on an island like Jamaica, there's not a lot of places to go, right? Whereas if you run away in Georgia, there are people who go on hikes today with GPS and get lost in places like Georgia because it's just so massive, right? Any questions about slavery in the southern colonies? Okay. So as far as the northern colonies go, we're going to talk a lot more about them when we talk about the revolution, because a lot of the unrest occurs in those areas. I did just want to mention the Salem witch trials real quick, 1692. They are an episode in American history that gets a lot of attention in terms of popular culture, movies, film, stuff like that. I think we even had some sources on the Salem witch trials, which is great. It's also somewhat of an anomaly in the larger kind of picture of witch trials, across the, not just the English colonies, but even across the larger world. But really, historically speaking, we're not really going to say a lot about the witch trials, except that the witch trials were a sign of a failing Puritan community. All right, that's simply what we're going to say there. Is that even though the Puritans were some of the first ones to come to New England, by the time you get to 1692, there's a lot of other people that are in the English colonies. You've gone through, at this point, an effort by the English king to create the Dominion of New England. The charters get revoked. That eventually is restored in the Glorious Revolution. Massachusetts gets its charter back, but it's not quite the same Puritan community that it once was. There are merchants there. There are other religions that are in the area. And so partially the Salem witch trials are a result of kind of like this Puritan community in crisis. And really after 1692, we won't be talking too much about the Puritans because simply just in terms of a demographic, they become less influential. There are other religious groups that become simply just more important after them. So you can kind of think of the witch trials as a sign. This is a sign that a much older way of life, an original way of life maybe, by the first English settlers in 1620, is coming to a conclusion. For example, Benjamin Franklin was raised a Puritan, and he, ran away from the church about as fast as he could, and a lot of other Puritans did. In fact, it was the middle colonies of Pennsylvania and New York that were the most populous. The middle colonies, again, were somewhere in between. So whereas when we said earlier about the southern and the northern colonies, right, whereas like the southern colonies make the most money, the northern colonies make the least money, the middle is somewhere in the middle there. The middle colonies were the most populous. In fact, Philadelphia and New York become the largest cities in the English colonies. And, these are colonies whose economies are based kind of like the northern economy, not a lot dealing with export, but, these colonies can especially produce food, right? They're sometimes referred to as the breadbasket of 13 colonies. So agriculture is especially rich. I think last time we had said that Pennsylvania was the most popular colony because of the mild climate, religious toleration, a rather democratic government. And there's a reason why Philadelphia is chosen as more or less the capital of the colonial world when the events of the Revolution begin to unfold. New York is also a very populated area as well. Okay, let's go ahead and get to the last part of chapter 3, and that is talking about these other long-term causes of the American Revolution. All right, so we got long-term causes. We already identified one: economics, namely the Navigation Acts. The fact that Great Britain is telling who the colonies can and cannot trade with doesn't sit well with most colonists. The second long-term cause we'll identify as the Enlightenment. All right, so this is number 2. And the third long-term cause is the Great Awakening. And by long-term causes, we mean like, okay, we mean like over the course of like 50 years. So maybe from, I don't know, what, 1700 till about 1776. This is just what's going on in the colonial world that is building resentment year after year after year after year, right? You might imagine if you're a merchant in the colonial world, you want to buy sugar, and it's the French that offer the lowest price. Well, according to the Navigation Acts, you're not allowed to buy sugar from France. That builds up, right, over time. And again, begins to cause, or plant the seeds anyways, of a lot of, sort of, maybe not distrust, but ill will, right, towards the British. The second long-term cause is the Enlightenment. We might identify this as a philosophical movement. Right, so these are all about ideas, the Enlightenment. Right, the Enlightenment is all about ideas. We talked a little bit about, well, actually, no, we didn't. Not quite yet. We'll get there in a second. It's a movement which puts science and reason as sort of primary above everything else. We might also add observation and logic. Right. So in other words, Enlightenment thinkers want to, on the whole, make society better. Now, I'll explain it a little bit better here in a second, because the Enlightenment doesn't make sense unless it's really understood where it's coming from, and we'll talk about it here in a moment, what its origins are. But just to begin with, understand the Enlightenment as a philosophical movement and a movement of new ideas. In terms of religion, religion's going to play an important role too in the 13 colonies and the American Revolution. And one thing that we should take note of is that there were many different sects of religion. For the most part, you did have religious minorities. A small number of Catholics did exist. A small number of Jews did exist. But really what we're talking about are all the different Protestants. Again, Protestants are those who don't recognize the Pope as being the authority of the Catholic Church. But Protestants come in a lot of different flavors, you might say. Some of the early Protestants that we talked about included the Puritans, the Pilgrims, right? We talked about both of those groups. We talked about the Anglicans. That's the Church of England. With new immigrants arriving, right, especially those from Germany, Germany tends to be more Lutheran, R-E-N, not sure if that's spelled correctly, but Lutherans. Martin Luther himself was German, right? So a lot of German Lutherans, a lot of Scottish Calvinists, right? Calvinism, the idea of predestination. And then there are other religious groups which are gaining, or actually another religious group that we mentioned last class we could add, Quakers, right? How can we forget our Quakers, right? So Puritans, Pilgrims, Anglicans, Lutherans, Calvinists, Quakers, and then the two religious groups which are growing the most in number, the Baptists and the Methodists. And this is not even, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I mean, we've already got 8 different groups of Protestants that are significant in the New World. And that's not even the end of it, right? There are more. But in other words, you're kind of getting an idea about, how religiously diverse the colonial religious makeup was. Again, all these different versions. You don't have to know all these different versions, but just know that it was pretty diverse there. And so this is related to the third and last major long-term cause of the revolution. That's the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is a religious movement. All right, so that's really the big difference there. So to understand the difference between the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, the Enlightenment is a philosophical movement. The Great Awakening is a religious movement. They're both based off ideas, but they're working kind of in two different realms. Interestingly enough, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening they're almost like opposite from one another in some ways. So for example, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers will reject religious dogmatism, religious dogma, religious ritual. It's not necessarily an anti-religious movement, the Enlightenment is. But, it doesn't have a lot of good things to, well, it's certainly influenced by religion. Maybe it is an anti-religious movement, but on the surface, they seem like they're opposite from one another. When you dig a little bit deeper, it's a little bit more complicated. But anyways, the Great Awakening was a giant religious movement which brought more people to church, we'll say that. So church attendance soared during the Great Awakening, and we might say that this was, again, roughly 1700 to 1776. The Great Awakening was a religious movement that appealed to a diverse audience. I realize I got my kind of notes going down in a stepped fashion here, but hopefully you can all still follow along. Its appeal was to a diverse audience. Recall older religious groups like the Puritans especially, said that religion was really only for men in some ways, or at least religious authority was only for men. In a lot of areas, especially in New England, it was only allowed for English people. The Great Awakening said, pretty much everybody can be part of these churches, especially the Baptists and the Methodists, right? These are the ones, the religious groups who gained the most out of the Awakening. The Awakening affects all these religious groups, but most intensely these two groups. It's a religious movement that includes more women than before, more Native Americans, and even more, Africans. A lot of slave masters inspired by this awakening movement become more, feel the pressure more intensely to convert their slaves to Christianity. So a lot more people, it's not just more people are being brought into churches, it's that the makeup of those people are becoming much more diverse in nature. George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards are the most famous Great Awakening revivalists. Pretty much the Great Awakening was like a traveling, they would hold traveling, sermons, or they call them revivals. You can kind of think of them as being like the, the festivals of the 1700s, right? So like when George Whitefield was preaching in your town, 20,000 people would show up. And this was a town that maybe only had 30,000 people. And everybody would go out, right? I like to say, it was the Coachella of 1757 or something like that, right? And these preachers were entertaining. They would get their audience involved. A good kind of slogan to go along with the Great Awakening is that religion is a matter of the heart, not the head. So it was much more based off of emotion, right? Religion is something you feel, not something you think about. And that was a break, right? Whereas before, really authority was only given to those people who were well learned with the Bible, who had studied it, who had went to college. In fact, the very first college, go down here, Harvard, first college in colonies, was created to train ministers. Yale as well. The Great Awakening led to more colleges being created. And again, some of these colleges were, embracing the Great Awakening, against the Great Awakening, et cetera, et cetera. So you might say of these two, Whitefield was the most popular. Jonathan Edwards was also a popular one. Whitefield was from England. Edwards was from the United States. And this new type of preaching, again, was very entertaining. It brought a lot more people to the faith. It spread the religion much more further. But it did a couple of things in terms of the American Revolution. And we'll just say this. It built communities with a culture of revolt, right? And that is when people would come to gather, to go to church and go to these events, they wouldn't only talk about matters related to religion. I mean, that's the reason for why the meeting might take place. But people would come and gather to talk about everything, including British laws regarding merchant activity, British laws regarding taxation. So it helped create a colonial community separate than a broader, what we might say, English community. And within a lot of those communities, it was this culture of revolt, because during the Great Awakening, people were more or less telling their preachers to get lost, right? Saying, look, I don't need to go to college in order to understand the Bible. All I need to do is feel my religion, right? It's emotional. I don't have to think about it. And so a lot of these denominations, right? You look at all these different denominations. Let's do this. Puritans, Pilgrims, Anglicans, Lutherans, Calvinists, Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, they split up into two pretty much sections, New Lights and the Old Lights. The New Lights were the ones who embraced the awakening. Right? They said this more emotional approach is better. It's better to bring in a more diverse audience. It's better to bring in more people for the church. This is the way to go. The Old Lights were like the old school, right? They said these idiots don't know what they're talking about. They don't even know how to read the Bible. How could they possibly be a preacher? They have no formal education in it. They don't understand the Word of God. You know, we're going to do things the old way. And all these different religious communities were broken up into those various sections, right? So you had Baptists who were New Lights, Baptists who were Old Lights, Quakers who were New Lights, Quakers who were Old Lights, etc., etc., etc. All right, any questions about the Great Awakening? Okay, let's get to the Enlightenment here, which is the last of our long-term causes. Like I mentioned before, the Enlightenment is a philosophical movement. It gets a lot of its basis off of the scientific revolution. Recall that Isaac Newton developed essentially the laws of physics. These were universal or natural laws that never changed. Enlightenment thinkers pretty much took some of the ideas from the scientific revolution and applied them to society. So the Enlightenment, is much more concerned with society and politics. And at the time, European society especially was represented by what was called the three estates, right? If we look at society, the three estates, and you see them both illustrated in these pictures. So here we have, I guess maybe this one might be a little bit easier. The first estate, which is represented by the nobility, right? So this would be in the orange, this would be your first estate. Your first estate here would probably be this guy back here as well, right? So the first estate was, nobility. And this included the kings and queens. And again, nobility is it's a status that is inherited, right? It's like, how do you become the king? Well, you just got to be born into it, right? And this is a societal, or this is a way of forming society that dated all the way back to the Middle Ages, right? It was landowners who, fought off all of their neighbors, laid claim to a piece of territory, built a castle to protect people from invasion, and passed that wealth down from generation to generation. And during the Middle Ages, because essentially there was no trade in Europe, the only way to, create a significant amount of wealth was by land ownership. And because there was constant warfare, peasants and serfs agreed to work on a lord's land, and that bloodline became noble, right? And so if you belonged to the first estate, you had all the privileges in the world. For example, in a place like France, you didn't have to pay any taxation, right? The second estate consisted of the clergy, right? The church. This guy right here. You can see, I think these are some bishops. This might even be a bishop right here, right? So we'll say number 2 is the church. Now, again, really up until the Protestant Reformation, the church had a lot of power and a lot of wealth too. Members of the church were exempt from taxation. Now, this, of course, changed a little bit with the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church was dealt a serious blow. But the church was still in a very powerful position. And then you had the last estate, which is represented as this guy being crushed right here. So you can get kind of a feel for what this cartoon is trying to illustrate. And they were just called the third estate. And that was just everybody else. Everybody. And at least in this picture, you can see how the third estate is being crushed by the nobility and the clergy. This picture on the right here does a little bit better job of illustrating what's going on, because historically most of the third estate was farmers, right? They were poor farmers that didn't have a dime to their name. But really, after the discovery of the New World and the introduction of commerce, right? Your Columbuses, your Da Gamas, your all these other merchants, there's a lot more trade going on. So there's a certain segment of the third estate that became very rich and very powerful. In fact, more rich and more powerful than even some of these members here. Now, even though the and I would say, you could probably put your George Washingtons in this category. You could probably put your Thomas Jeffersons. These were not people who were nobles, right? There was practically no noble class in the English colonies. The nobility were the landowners back in England, and you didn't give up that land because that was essentially your entitled social and cultural and legal standing. Instead, the people who moved to the New World were those who, again, didn't have the noble bloodlines back in England, had nothing to lose essentially, but made a ton of money, right? A guy like George Washington, now granted, most of Washington's wealth comes from the fact that he married into it, right? His wife's father was very wealthy. But George Washington's a guy who was way more wealthy than a lot of the nobility back in England, and that really goes to represent kind of the changing dynamic of society and the economy. Anyways, what does all this have to do with the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment says, look, there has to be a better way to create society and a better way to create politics. And when we think about society, what the Enlightenment thinkers want is a society based off merit, not inheritance, right? So ability, right? It makes no sense that just because you're born to a special family, that your bloodline is noble, that you should be given any privileges. In terms of politics, they're really mostly anti-monarchy. Now, Enlightenment thinkers debate about how exactly new government should be created, but they can all agree, essentially say, monarchy is a bad idea. It makes absolutely no sense to have one person in charge of everybody, and for that one person to only get his job because he was born that way, right? So they're looking for new ways to restructure society and restructure the monarchy. John Locke is probably the most famous and important Enlightenment thinker, at least for the United States. His idea is natural laws or natural rights. It says all people are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. John Locke is also a supporter of the social contract, which states that governments are made by the people for the people, that governments are designed to protect natural rights, and if governments fail to do so, then people have the right to alter or abolish it. In terms of the Americas, John Locke was English. Benjamin Franklin is the best example of the sort of, he's like the Enlightenment personified, right? He was a scientist. He was a printer, right? He did it all. He was the most well-known and respected person in the 13 colonies before the Revolution, even known in Europe, right? He was that famous at the time. And again, he represented everything that the Enlightenment was about. Now, thanks to technology, specifically the printing press and the newspaper, the 13 colonies was, or first of all, we'll say that ideas spread very rapidly. It was one of the most literate places in the world, especially the North, right? So just think about it, right? All of these ideas regarding natural rights and social contract, these ideas spread very rapidly in the colonial world. They probably spread more in the 13 colonies than anywhere else in the world at the time, right? It's not an exaggeration to say that the northern 13 colonies were the most literate place in the world at the time. And so by the time you get to 1776, everybody knows about John Locke's ideas, right? Everybody knows about the idea of government being a social contract, right? Consent. That governments don't rule over people, governments rule with the consent of the people. Just a couple more things I'll mention here. So that's more or less the Enlightenment in a nutshell. Benjamin Franklin, I'm not going to add too much about this, but he also helped spread. He's a scientist. He also helped spread new inventions. A lot of the terminology related to electricity. You might have also heard things like the bifocal glasses and stuff like that. One last thing to conclude, and this is again kind of on the eve of 1776, and that is the form of government. So for the most part, in all 13 colonies, governments slightly differ, but there are some similarities. For the most part, every colony has some democracy / representative government, right? Each of the 13 colonies are different, but in some way, shape, or form, every single colony has some sort of democracy, some sort of representative government, right? And this dates back to a very long history of self-governments in the colonies. The House of Burgesses in Virginia, created all the way back in 1617 or something like that, 150 years before the American Revolution. It's also true that all the colonies have a governor and an assembly. The governor wants what's best for Britain. Right? Governors are sometimes elected, they're sometimes chosen, they're sometimes appointed. Again, it depends on what colony you're talking about. The assemblies are always democratically elected by the colonies themselves. And the assemblies always want what's best for the colonists, right? So next week, when we start talking more about how the American Revolution unfolds, pay attention to this dynamic in the colonies, right? On the one hand, every single colony has a governor. The governor wants what's best for Britain. Every single colony also essentially has an assembly. The assembly wants what's best for the colony, right? Sometimes that is the same thing. So in the southern colonies, the governor and the assembly are usually always on the same page, right? The governor wants to make more money and the assembly wants to make more money, right? Cash crops. In the north, they don't always agree. And it's through some of these conflicts, you might say, that the American Revolution unfolds. Okay, so